Hello there and welcome to Travels with Geordie. If this is your first visit, my name is Peter Knowles and I live on this classic wooden motor cruiser here in Victoria, British Columbia, along with the very great memory of my pup Geordie, all the while fixing it up for some pretty major cruising someday. But if that's the sort of thing you might be interested in, please consider sticking around and subscribing. We'd love to have you. So this boat, this is my friend's boat, MV Zephyrus, and we're going to carry on getting it ready for some cruising and perhaps more importantly, a Holland. And that means bottom one. Well, yes, it's time to start building the scarphing sled. And when I mean scarphing sled, I mean a jig made out of wood where I can take a piece of wood and carve a long wedge on it. In other words, go from a full thickness here down to a knife edge at that edge, following this plane. And I'm going to do that with a router, with an end mill router bit in it. And I can't freehand that, so I need to create like a little ramp that I can run this router on. Let me show you what I'm thinking. Okay, so here I have a nice new Makita trim router, 1/4 inch chuck, and a nice new bottom cleaning bit which will go in there with an extra long shaft. Now some will say that's a very big router bit for a 1/4 inch shaft, and it is. So I'll have to take very gentle cuts to be able to do this safely. Now the trick is I need a long shaft because of the way the router is going to be mounted in the sled and sliding down on an angle against this wood. And the longer the shaft is, the more flexibility I have in the way this is all going to be built. Let's get on with it. I'm making this project out of red oak, largely because it's readily available, and in other words, readily available already dressed, which isn't so quick to get mahogany, and it's incredibly strong. Not an ideal boat building wood, but perfectly fine for jigs and such. This is the microest of shops. The reason I've been doing all this work in the cockpit of MV Zephyrus lately is because I don't want to turn my boat back into a shop right now, because while working on this boat, we're kind of living on my boat, and my cockpit sawdust will pour into the bilge, where in this cockpit everything can be vacuumed up. So that's why. Okay, this is the basics of the frame for the jig, and it's going to have ramps up here that the rotor will slide on so that it cuts a scarf on that bevel. Now the trick is I want this to be adjustable. The gap here, let's call it the throat, has to be able to open for different sizes of planks, and I want to be able to run the side of the rotor right against it so I don't have to be steering, or in other words worrying about the width of the cut, and I just slap back and forth in there. So this needs to be adjustable back and forth. So I'm going to do that by putting a slot in here and a carriage bolt up through and a knob on top. So thus the router table, I need to cut slots. Easy peasy. Okay, so I want a slot between these two and between those two. So my 1/4 inch straight bit, it'll be a plunge and then work my way, but you'll see what I'm doing here. Now to countersink a little bit for the heads of the carriage bolts. Now in time I'll put some washers under here. Okay, so there's the fundamental frame. Basically I can loosen it up and line this up against the underlying plank, and if I line this edge up exactly where it is, the edge of the router will stop right at that point. Okay, we got lots more to do. Okay, so this is the stock I'm going to use to cut the wedges or the ramps in, and instead of sort of freehanding it, which I am known to do because this requires a little more accuracy, I've taken a block, put a couple of screws in it, and I'm going to offset it exactly the full width of this stock, which is inch and a half over 12 is 1 8. And so if I just catch this edge with the table saw, I'm technically going to do a perfect job of this. I have to take into account the kerf. There we go, right there. All right then, so leaving a gap there for the kerf, if my calculations are correct, I'm going to run this right through here, lop off my perfect piece. So to get these two exactly the same, I just line them up and mark it. Well, I would say that worked very, very well. Let's make two more. Okay. And just to make sure they're really flush, I'm just going to clamp them together and do a little sanding here. You can see that the ends are slightly out of alignment because they are actually slightly beveled, and that is a problem I had with my plywood being ever so slightly curved. It's amazing how these things accentuate, but a little bit of tidying up here will solve that. There we go, perfect. I can't tell you how much I want to get that burnout, but it really just isn't worth sanding that much out of there. Anyway, okay, so 4 perfect scarfing ramps. Okay, so from here on in, I got to make sure I keep the jig square, because as you can imagine, if I loosen these, the whole thing can swivel like a parallelogram, which is not acceptable. And I'm going to have some blocks in here to help me with that later. But I've just got to clamp down now nice and square so I can start to install the wedges, which basically go here and here and the same at the opposite end. Oh, I must say red oak does hold a screw beautifully. Okay, so that's done. The ramps are on. This is probably a good time to explain why I have a double-ended scarfing sled here. In other words, why there's ramps at both ends. Well, my philosophy of scarfing in terms of this particular application, which is to remove butt blocks. We're going to have a butt joint in the planking of a boat, and I want to take out that butt joint and the block behind it because I think it's a vulnerability, and scarf both sides of that in an exact match. In other words, in perfect alignment, because this will keep the two scarves in perfect alignment. And then when I drop in the Dutchman, which is also cut with this same jig but backwards, it will slip right in, at least in terms of the scarves. There's other things you have to do. There's the spiling to make sure that the width, the plank is the right width. But in terms of actually the two scarves mating perfectly, it should work perfectly, regardless of the curvature of the hull. Neat, eh? Let's get into that in a bit. All right, so I mentioned I have to make sure the jig can't twist, in other words, become a parallelogram, because then the two ramps would become out of alignment and I wouldn't get a nice scarf. So I need to be able to keep it somewhat square, but then again, it's also adjustable. So what I've decided to do is put two blocks in here, one here and one at the other end, but only on one side, because this side could almost always stay tight and the other side could open and close to adjust the throat for the width of the plank. Now I have to take into account the possibility of a plank being tapered, because no plank on a boat is completely parallel from end to end. So there'll be a slight taper, that's why it's adjustable. But this leaves a little bit of play, enough to do, I don't know, as much as ½ an inch difference from one end to the other, which you'd never get. Quarter would be a lot. And maintain it as square as possible to cut good scarves. So let's just get these on. Oh, yes! I am liking the way this is coming together. Now, there are quite a few more steps to this. Could you guess? First thing I got to do next is find a way to make sure that it doesn't rock on the surface of a curved hull. As I attach this to the hull, and I'm going to do it with screws. Basically, there's going to be a screw right there and a screw right there that's going to go in to hold the whole jig against the plank, which I'll have to fill later. But because the boat is curved, I can't be pulling it tight or it'll flex the whole thing. So I need to add some little feet here and here that'll stand off and be adjustable in such a way that I can sit and I can decide exactly how it's going to sit against the curvature of the hull. So my idea, and I really don't know how clever it is yet, is to use these little furniture clamps. It's basically used in European style furniture. This basically screws into a hole in wood and giving you a machined surface you can, or a nut basically, that you can screw this Allen key into the classic IKEA assembly style. So what I thought I could do is drill a hole here that's just exactly the right size, screw this into it, and then I have an adjustable foot that I can slide in and out very easily and very quickly. I don't even need the Allen key, I can just twist it with my fingers to accommodate the curve of the hull. This one I'm going to start with. Who knows if it'll work. Okay folks, well these are really slick. They're basically the threaded insert has threads on it, very coarse threads to go in this hole, and an Allen key hole socket. So I can just take this and drive this in. Perfect. Pretty cool. I now have basically adjustable feet. Okay, we built the bulk of the basic sled. So now it's about how are we going to run the rotor up and down this slope? Well, that looks easy. You just run the rotor up and down the slope, right? Well, not really, because this is closed all the way right now, much narrower than any plank, and I have to be able to move back and forth to be able to cut the entire slope of the scarf. So I need some sort of plate on here. And I'll tell you, I need a very thin plate because of the length of the rotor bit. It has to reach all the way down there. And it'd also be great if the plate was clear. Well, what are we talking about? We're talking about Lexan, right? So let's get some Lexan. Isn't that lovely and clear? Of course, it'll never be that clear again after I start messing with it. Well, that was clever. I tied it up and did the edges on this piece of plexiglass, except it was the cutoff. This is my actual piece. All right, no harm.
Yeah, you should read that. You might enjoy it. And it's this kumbu seaweed that's like highly prized in Japan.
So here's the existing router base. First thing to do here is take off the existing second base. It's probably a phenolic of some sort. That of course saves me a little extra thickness and also gives me access to the threaded holes so that I could screw the plexiglass, the Lexan base, onto the aluminum section. Easy peasy. Okay, so this is a bit frustrating. I've clamped the plexiglass to the bottom and now I have to drill exactly where the threaded bosses are in the bottom here, and that's just a little, yeah. Okay, I'm 2 for 4. These two lined up perfectly, so I've got them screwed in. Now I just gotta get these two perfect, and yeah. Well, I must say that is quite satisfying. It all lined up perfectly. Not that I wasn't a little bit anxious about that. Okay, now we're a long way from done. Got to drill a hole through here, obviously, and the easiest way I can think of doing that is chucking up the router bit and just punching it straight through. What do you say? Actually, 1/4 inch chuck, I can just chuck up a drill bit. All right, so here we go. Beauty. All right then, so here's a basic mock-up of the setup. I still haven't taken the protective goop off the rotor bit, but I just want to explain why I have set up the rotor so far offset on the piece of Lexan. And that's because to get the maximum depth, as you see this slides back and forth, if I bring it to you, maybe you can see there how it slides in and out. To get the maximum depth, which I require, I have to be able to get the rotor as close to the bottom of the ramp as possible. In other words, way down here. So actually putting the rotor in the middle of this piece of Lexan, I couldn't get far enough down the ramp with the extension I could safely put on this router bit to be able to cut down deep into the plank on the hull as I could. So that's why that's offset like that. But of course, that's fine. It gives me plenty of structure by having all the extra stuff here. I can easily hold that and then just run that right down to there. Excellent. Now, I have to also I can slide up and down and I can slide left and right, but I want to limit how I slide left and right because I don't want to be chewing up the edge of either the sled or the adjoining plank. It's very, very crucial that I make this cut down the edge of the plank. If we were to imagine that these are planks, I want to be able to cut only the plank that I'm removing and not damage the adjoining plank, which of course is much closer to this. So I'm going to put a guide that is exactly the width of the router bit on the bottom of this, and that will allow this to lock. Let me just do it and you'll see what I mean. Okay, so I've made this ever so slightly wider than 1.5 inches because it's going to be the guide block, and that'll make sure that the bit can't cut as wide as this is, slightly about a 16th or a 32nd each side smaller, meaning that I won't mess up the sides of my my sled. There we go. Let's confirm that's square. And you know, it doesn't even have to be square, but it is. Excellent. Perfect. Okay, now I just have to re-drill with the hole saw that hole through the wood as well. There we go. Come through. Beauty. All right, so it's time to peel the protective material off this bit. This should be wonderfully satisfying. Kind of a waxy, oily combination. Now this is a special kind of router bit called a bottom cleaning bit. Although it cuts on the sides, it's primarily designed to cut at the bottom face here, meaning it makes a very, very clean bottom cut. I have no fingernails right now for some reason, which is a drag because I can't play my banjo. That's probably good for you guys. There we go. And it's clear. Now this thing is sharp as heck. Of course I have to touch it. It's like touching wet paint, right? Woo! Okay, so I've got it chucked up and the maximum depth is right there. So let's put this into the sled. And as I slide this along now, you can see, if you're looking from there, I gotta lift this up a bit, so that this new piece here makes sure that as I go to the side, the bit doesn't actually cut into the side of the sled, or worse yet, the side of the plank, which is directly below this. And so you can see now that that will slide all the way down to there, or all the way along to here. I can't wait to try it. Woohoo! Okay, so I have a pretty spiffy jig for cutting the scarfs on the boat, but now I have to create a jig that will cut scarfs in a Dutchman. In other words, a piece of wood that is going to be set into the cutout in the actual hull that will create the scarfed joint. So what I need to do now is find a way on this piece of plywood to create a jig that will hold one end of it so I can put a scarf in the opposite direction. And that should be pretty straightforward. I'm going to sort of mock this up because I'm not quite sure this is the way I want to do it, but let me get started here. Basically, what I've done is I've created a couple of pieces of wood that will act as sort of rails that are that the sled will sit up on, just like that. And that sets the depth correct to be able to cut the scarf properly. And I'll put another piece of wood on here to clamp down. But you'll see what I'm doing. Let's just get started. And then just a little support on the far side here. If this jig works as well as I hope it's going to, then I will probably build something a little more substantial, but for the meantime, this will do. the clamp. So let's try this out, shall we? Woohoo! I set the depth as deep as possible and I slid it as far down the slope as it'll go, and now I can just make a mark right on the plywood where the last tip of the blade is going to touch, right there. Yes, 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 yes. Okay. Okay, so last thing I need to do is move this whole rig into the cockpit because it's windy today and I can't put all this yellow cedar into the air, which will go instantly into the ocean, so I have to trap it in the cockpit, and but that's pretty straightforward. Let's go. Okay, well, here we go. I thought I was going to put the wood in, clamp it, and then keep adjusting the depth of the router, but that's a bit fussy. I'd rather just set this at its preferred depth and just keep advancing the wood along. Now you say, well, we can't do that when we're on the boat, and that's true, but I think I'm gonna make some modifications to the way the sled actually works. So in the meantime, let's just cut a scarf, shall we? Which means I'm gonna set this right here, and we'll just advance the wood along a little bit. Okay, here goes nothing. So there's the first cut. Ooh, silky smooth. I'm hoping you guys are close enough to see what's actually going on here. Let me move you just a little closer, right about there. And it's time to advance it on a bit. Well, that took longer than I would have thought. It took about 10 minutes, but I think I can take a much deeper bite. Anyway, I'm totally thrilled. Well, hello and welcome to the Travels with Geordie Scotch of the Week. Yes, I think this week merits a Scotch, really. First off, I want to send out so much gratitude and thanks, beginning with my daughters who have been wonderfully supportive through this, and their mother also just wonderfully supportive, my friends and neighbors here at the marina, and you all. It's been unbelievable, the messages I've received, both through various channels, poems even. Thank you all so very, very much. It means an awful lot to me. I really, really feel the love. And someone else who Geordie meant an awful lot to is going to join us this evening. Welcome. Surprise. This is the owner of MV Zephyrus.
And of course it's been a hugely emotional week, a very difficult week. Geordie meant a lot to me as well as to everyone else, and also to my pup Griffin, and he will be very much missed.
Should we have a quick dram?
Let's have one.
We're going to Isla for some McClellans, and this is a favorite of ours. We like to always keep it around, so let's have just a little splash. Yeah, maybe not too little a splash, eh?
Thank you.
Well, folks, this has been quite a week, but truthfully, in some ways wonderful, strangely. To Geordie.
To Geordie.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Oh yeah. I think we're going to do more Scotch of the Week, don't you think? Yeah, that's okay. So we'll say goodbye, and we'll see you next week. Ta-pa.